for philosophy. Okay, Carolyn, you said coming from the East Coast, found Theosophy in the West Coast, in Santa Barbara. And yes, teachers and teachings, and student for over 50 years. And yeah, you will tell us about philosophy. Carolyn Dorrance.
I hope you're all bright-eyed and mind ablaze, because we're going to do philosophy all day, starting though at 9 o'clock in the morning. I don't know if that's a good idea. Images of Plato's banquet come to mind. The handout is more as a reference sheet that might be handy in your study circles. I will be speaking to them, but it didn't seem that not to dwell on them. And the first page, I never could remember the title of this conference, so I thought it'd be nice to just remind ourselves, Theosophy, the living source of all integral wisdom, returning to the source of science, philosophy, and religion. And this general question, how do you think today's religions, philosophies, and sciences would look if they were based entirely on Theosophy? And a fundamental starting point, Theosophy is one reality that can be viewed simultaneously from 3 or 7 states of consciousness. So how that might affect your thinking is really up to your thinking. So philosophy, the etymological meaning of philosophy is typically given as the love of wisdom. You've probably all heard that. Maybe you heard that in a Philosophy 101 course. Philo, equal to love. Sophia, wisdom. Yet HBB or someone working with her says in the reading that you have in the handout that the word philosophy is best translated as divine love, and that common definition is not correct. There's a little bit of debate or doubt about who actually wrote that paragraph. Was it HBB speaking, or was it one of her assistants published in the volume 14, which was done after her passing? So, but we don't have to dwell on that. So it's seen as an idea by her that love of wisdom is not the correct definition of philosophy. What is the difference, and why is her definition best? We'll talk about that, but for starters, we could note that love of wisdom implies that there is a lover, that there is a subject, a center of agency, that seeks wisdom but may not have attained wisdom that is very elusive. Whereas the term divine love suggests that there exists in metaphysical space a reservoir of divine love from which can emanate love, and throughout nature. Its influence descends from down into the centers of consciousness. Its existence does not depend on some individual seeker to create. So you can see there's an important difference there. Rather, the experience of divine love requires a special spiritual level of consciousness that is influenced by what is divine or eternal. In either case, these two definitions are inspirational. Hearing about Pythagoras and his love of wisdom may lead us to sign up, particularly if we're 18 years old, for a philosophy course with the expectation that we will learn answers to life's burning questions, such as, is there a God? What is the purpose of human life? Is it true that I am an immortal soul? Is there a clear distinction between what is bad and what is good? Is there evil? What is justice? And how do we explain inequality in human circumstances? Our exploration into academic philosophy to find answers to these questions might bring some disappointment. The curriculum and methods offered in philosophy courses today seem dry and irrelevant. That is because for centuries, since Pythagoras coined the terms philosophy and cosmos, many concepts and methods of philosophy have been developed, especially in the 20th century. A list of the types or concepts of philosophy taking us down many intellectual paths, but not to anything resembling divine love, is offered there in the handout. Not surprisingly, enrollment in philosophy classes in recent decades has shrunk, often to under 100 majors in, say, at UCSB, while hundreds of students sign up to take religious studies courses or courses in global studies and become majors in those popular fields. The list you have is primarily based upon 19th and 20th century development, so to speak, and I will only mention a few of them, and I'm starting from the more recent to the older types of philosophy. And it's a list that has, as we'll point out, its inadequacies, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You might find some of them useful as preliminary tools, you might say, for philosophical analysis. The one that developed in the 1920s, well, 30s really, 20s, 30s, is to focus on linguistic and etymological analysis. This is part of a broader label, analytical philosophy, and it was contended that the only real and fruitful type of analysis is to look at words very carefully, because in the 19th century there was a tendency in philosophy history to use rather vague words and grand generalizations, so it was a reaction against them. It becomes a very narrow focus and bound up with technicalities like what is a sentence, what is a statement, what is a proposition, also labeled philosophical logic. And believe me, to write a paper in philosophical logic is a significant challenge. And one of the most influential in this mode was Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is a very puzzling genius. He came full throttle into the recognition, just study words, just study words. But then he came to the conclusion that no, words aren't any use. We should just try to describe in pictures what is true, what is real, what exists. And then he became a mystic, and then and a conscientious objector from, although he fought in the war, he then changed a lot of his ideas because of the experience of war, and he kind of went back to linguistic analysis. And he was influential both in England and Germany. And so that's, in some areas, that's seen as the only true way to do philosophy. If you ascertain, though, came others, we can broaden it a little bit. If you try to find out the meaning and use of words in a particular culture, a particular society, G.E. Moore was one of those leaders. And so that opens the door to diversity, because as we heard yesterday, even in India, the word duty or dharma, translated as duty, has at least two major meanings. And the meaning that Gandhi might give to duty will be very different from the meaning that the liberal philosopher of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, would give to the word duty. And so that leads to kind of a relativity of knowledge. So if you go that route, you might come out with quite a different affirmation of what's true than if you were looking at a different culture, a different society. Both those methods morphed for some into conceptual analysis, which is a level of abstraction. So the concept of justice, the concept of beauty, that's the direction philosophers took. James Hillman's word use of archetypes, which was kind of popular in Jungian thought. Plato's forms are at that level of knowledge. And then the recognition then that a statement that is philosophical will be only a statement of relative knowledge in a culture or a society. Another tack is an instrumental. Jeremy Bentham in the early 19th century said philosophy should be about finding the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Very practical benefit. And skip all this metaphysics or abstractions, just do an analysis of how the majority of people in a society will attain by your public policies happiness. There's the ideological approach, which many philosophers think is not philosophy and should be relegated to political science or somewhere. But for others, it's seen as philosophical. Very interestingly, and some of you, and we've really heard examples of that, and certainly Jim Colbert was aware of that, is how philosophy morphed into psychology. And new disciplines were created, economics, politics, anthropology, psychology, because it was thought that more attention had to be paid to the nature of human beings and their behavior. And we could see there's an opening there for a great deal of theosophical analysis. You also get that fragmentation that comes from recognizing or claiming that philosophy exists within disciplines. There's a philosophy of science, a philosophy of history. I noticed a book in your bookstore the other day entitled The Philosophy of Dance. So what that is, I haven't the slightest idea, but at least it recognizes that philosophy has to do with establishing axioms or assumptions or presuppositions for every line of thinking. And we might say that in Theosophy, it's the three fundamentals, that you have to accept those for purposes of thinking things through. There are also, historically, of course, the philosophy made by great minds. So it said that that have worked out a comprehensive, you might say, statement of philosophy. We recognize Plato, Aristotle, Spinoza, who's an excellent example of the rigor of starting with key assumptions and working through a series of propositions that can cover all kinds of topics, including social harmony and freedom. So he's, of course, famous for his statement, freedom comes really is responding to necessity, which not a definition Americans tend to like. I also thought that we could add to that little list there Theosophy, because Theosophy is a comprehensive, step-by-step system of ideas. And it does have an author in HBB and a big book, The Secret Doctrine, but academics have not yet made that leap, and we'll address that question a little later. But generally, philosophy is seen as a rational and comprehensive result of reasoning, dianoia. It's one of my favorite, it's my favorite Greek word. There's intuitionism. Plotinus, the Neoplatonic philosopher, Plotinus is one of the best examples. And we hear from HBB that that higher level, that of Buddhic insight is very valuable in actually giving quite directly knowledge of what is true or real. So we don't want to leave that out of our possibility. And last on the list is another type of philosophy that most contemporary philosophies would toss out. Please get rid of that. Theological doctrines, dogmas. I suppose the best example of that would be Thomas Aquinas, who worked very hard in 3 big volumes to do a statement of what is true and why the reasons it's true. So you can see that there are many types of philosophy. So when someone asks me the question, what is philosophy anyway, there isn't an easy answer. But there is disappointment. If you're that student in Philosophy 101, by the time you got through an introductory course, you might be very unhappy. I didn't get my deep felt questions answered. Where's the love? Where is the inspiration? Where's the relevance to my life and its challenges? This course just created more confusions, not clarity, or certainly not any ethical guidance. Should I resign myself to just seeing my shrink once a month, or my physical therapist twice a month? Should I change my major to science? There's nothing there that really is attractive and influential in contemporary philosophy many have created. Should I find a whole different approach to philosophy? Question 1, really. Yes, there is an ancient source of wisdom and knowledge that has been found out by the meditation of seers and adepts. Countless generations of thinkers have peered into metaphysical space and discerned what is real, what is true, what exists in a great ocean of wisdom. They have shared their insights with others until a consensus is developed and represented in symbols and glyphs. Try this in a graduate seminar in philosophy. Theosophy expresses this ancient wisdom in the 3 fundamentals and encourages deductions, such as found in the secret doctrine. Historically, other efforts to think philosophically have been developed in India. Where else? Bharat. Dialogues of questions and answers produced a body of knowledge called the Upanishads. They became an alternative to the recitations and rituals offered in the Vedas. Most of the Upanishads have disappeared, but those rescued indicate a process of learning whereby the seeker or the student sits down to engage in dialogue with a teacher or guru. So Upanishads is usually translated as come and sit. And usually there's an image added of a teacher sitting on the ground, cross-legged, under a tree. And it became a rather attractive image in the 60s when people were thinking of some whole different way to learn than going to church. The Upanishads, there's over 200, it's estimated, that still are that are known. Many have been lost from textual study. Their period is about roughly 800 to 400 BCE. In the second later period, 100 BCE to 1500 Common Era. So there's, and the second round tends to be more practical, showing a variety of contemporary issues of that era. They have been translated. I would suggest, where did I put it? Oh, here. I remember first contacting the Upanishads, I think it was in the 70s, through this little book, Selections from the Upanishads and the Tao Te Ching, that was published in 1951, but its translator is Charles Johnson, a very well-known theosophist, who also did the translations of Shankaracharya's verses. So if you kind of want to know, well, what is we'll be talking about this, what what are the Upanishads? Here's a very inspiring introduction, but there's other more complete and definitive introductions that can one find, including in your bookstore, until some of them got bought out on Sunday. So this gives us a very vivid image of, well, how do we learn what is true, what is real, what is just? Well, we have to go and sit down and listen and engage in dialogue with somebody who seems to know. And that's very consistent with Theosophical recitations. In the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, named The Drama of Mysteries by Charles Johnson, a sage, Vajnavalka, came to the palace of a king, Janaka, who actually appears in several of the Upanishads, and that's kind of interesting. A symbol of political authority, a king, he wants to debate, but the sage was determined not to engage him openly. As a political authority, he wasn't really trusted. But after some debate, the sage offered the king a boon. The king chose to ask questions according to his desire, and the sage assented, seeing something of sincerity in this king. The first question asked by the king was, what is the light of the spirit of man? And you can see that's a different kind of question that might be reached in some of the other contemporary types of philosophy we mentioned. And the sage responds, with the sun as his light, as he rests, goes forth, doth his work, and return. But what, the king asks, is the light when the sun has set? Well, the moon, says the sage. But when the moon is not visible, what is the source of light in man? And this answer and subsequent answers, such as fire and sound, are all rejected for their relative limitations. Finally, the sage says, the soul then becomes his light. The king, who's kind of getting into this process of Q&A, quickly responds, well, what is the soul? And the sage answers, it's consciousness in the life powers, responds the sage. He then gives an elaborate explanation of the soul's experiences, including its passage into a state of dreamlessness, wherein the soul has passed beyond fear or evil and experiences the highest joy. Death, paradise, rebirth, and liberation are also topics of the dialogue. It concludes, quote, and you have a page full of quotations from the Upanishads, this mighty soul, unborn, grows not old, nor dies, for the soul is immortal and fearless. The soul is the fearless eternal. He grows one with the eternal, the fearless eternal who knows this. So this is getting into territory that you won't find in contemporary academic philosophy. Thus, inspiration, it is a conversation, obviously this is not the language of modern philosophy, nor is the dialogue restricted to a sensory or materialistic level of observation. It is a conversation consistent with theosophical teaching, and it can awaken the inner and spiritual powers in a human being. Thus, inspiration, self-transcendence, and soul memory become part of philosophical exploration. Other dialogues, such as the well-known Katha Upanishad in the House of Death, continue the focus on the unchanging internal that cannot be discovered by meditation or debated by formal logic. In the Chandogya Upanishad, the correspondence between the human soul and metaphysical reality is reinforced with the mantra, that thou art, repeatedly declared. In contrast to the mixed motives of contemporary philosophers, the quality of humility is stressed. The philosophical quest is expressed in the student's request "Let the teacher teach me more. Let it be so, dear," said he. And additional passages stress the transcendental and eternal reality of the human observer and real universe that one lives in. Another quote, "It is the unchanging eternal, it is the unchanging supreme. Having understood that unchanging one, whatsoever a man wishes, that he gains. It is the excellent foundation, the supreme foundation. Knowing that foundation, a man is mighty in the eternal world." Even though this eternal source is entered into a secret place, it's hidden in secret, the mystery, the ancient, understanding that bright one by the path of union with the inner self. The wise man leaves exaltation and sorrow behind. And so you might look at those other quotes. You can see that it's a whole different field of investigation, that the mind reaches to a state of insight by listening and asking questions. Another example of true philosophical instruction, we could say, is given by the Greek philosopher Plato. There are two branches of Platonic inquiry: the teachings expressed through Plato's rendition of Socrates, and the metaphysical representations of the noumena, or forms, found out by dianoia, thinking things through. We actually think there's a third branch of Platonic thought, which might be called esoteric, or further into the mysteries, but we're going to leave that one out there for you to find. Socrates poses as the student that any one of us can become, and that's really an important point relative to the view that the philosopher is an unusual, extreme being with a level of mind and consciousness that few others could ever attain to. Socrates claims that, quote, "I am the wisest man alive, for I know one thing, and that is I know nothing. I cannot teach anybody, and I can only make them think." You've probably heard that quote. As in Theosophy, he insists, this is Socrates, that thinking with critical and logical honesty is what frees us from conventional opinions and prejudiced delusions. And that's very much part of the Platonic approach, is distinguishing between thinking and having opinions or beliefs. Because how many times have you yourself or heard somebody say, "Well, in my opinion," and then thinking that's philosophy. We must think things through because, quote, "the unexamined life is not worth living." The myth of Earth suggests how human souls become trapped at birth in attachments to desires developed in previous lives, and thus forget their true identity and potential as an immortal soul. The metaphysical inquiry of Plato, I might mention, you can easily find a list of 80 Socratic propositions online, as many others, and many other lists if you're curious. The metaphysical inquiry of Plato is abstract, transcendental, and challenging. Its depth and breadth provide a fundamental framework for discovering what is true and real. Like Pythagoras, it might be said of Plato that he did not claim to be called the philosopher, namely one who knows every hidden thing in things visible, cause and effect, or absolute truth, but would call himself simply a sage, as did Pythagoras, an aspirant to philosophy or to wisdom of love. Love in its exoteric meaning being as degraded by men then as it is now by purely terrestrial applications. For centuries, Plato's metaphysics was rejected in favor of the linear approach of Aristotle, who was accepted in the Middle Ages by the Catholic Church as the philosopher. And it's during that period that Thomas Aquinas was allowed to continue thinking out and writing his 3 volumes of philosophical responses to basic Catholic teaching. One of his ambitions was to prove the existence of God with philosophy, and he claims to have found 5 different ways that you can prove the existence of God. But periodical revivals of Platonic philosophy kept alive the experience of divine love, the unity of all life, and the potential for spiritual illumination in all humanity. Also, both Plato and Socrates pointed to invisible sources or masters of wisdom who were the guardians of truth and the knowledge developed in the ancient source. One could see the presentation of Theosophy in the late 19th century as a way of making making Platonic philosophy accessible to everyone and anyone who sought true ideas that awakened and resonated within the soul, and who found harmony in thought and feelings within themselves, as well as a universal synthesis of religion, philosophy, and science. Now, so you can see a lot of room for expansion in both the level and the description of human possibility in those ancient sources, and you might find them valuable in answering your questions. Now, if you think about it, though, you want to, so what do I do now? I'm not going to go back and just pick up one of those old, narrow types of philosophy. What should be my approach? We recommend that, first of all, you have a sense of an aim of your quest. What is it you want to know? In the handout, the handout you had on philosophy, there's a lot of clues in the paragraph, creative integration, and the aim of developing a magnanimous mind, the dynamic fusion of the alpha intellect and the alpha heart. And this points to a sublime ethical intelligence, and its unfoldment would reintegrate our mental, moral, and spiritual lives. So that could be a much more, you might say, inward quest than you might expect, instead of just proving something in formal logic. There is an example of many examples of how to develop your inner capacity to do philosophy. In order to really connect with the sacred, you need boundless generosity and consummate grace. And such a spiritual mentality would evince a marvelous Buddhic mobility, which excel at shifting its focus from the theoretical to the practical, from the moral to the psychological, from prose to poetry, from the local to global, and back again. So that would be much grander aims of philosophy, but aims that could be proved by your own inner insights and your own inner identity with that which is most high and most universal. You will need and this is kind of a second point of guidance, you will need in your quest to do philosophy new language. And it's interesting that in one of the talks on Tuesday, that was mentioned, that yes, we have this marvelous presentation of ideas in the 19th century movement of theosophical ideas, but we need to recognize that there's something in us that has to be developed, and we need to recognize the need for new language. And that's why the old forms of philosophical inquiry are so inadequate. And you can already see that just by reading some of the Upanishads. One of the most important distinctions is between the noetic and the psychic, and HBB writes of that in her very groundbreaking essay. And of course, it's possible to absorb new language. Take the word karma. 100+ years ago, I don't think many people were talking about karma. And now we even have karma mentioned in the analysis of a baseball game. So, and then if we begin to bring that term in, and people start asking questions, we know the next link is reincarnation. And again, which has more than one term to refer to the process. So that is just, but certainly the idea of a higher self, just that even the term self-transcendence. You have this in Emerson, kind of a pioneer, you might say, in theosophical language, but not commonly used in dialogue about truth and knowledge. So that's perhaps where we're at, and I think we all know the experience of trying to do that. What's the language? What's the terminology? So linguistic analysis has its place that should be used to describe what is true, what is real, what is good. And only then, and of course we now talk about levels of consciousness, and contemporary thinkers, some of them are kind of inching up there and saying, yeah, we have to talk about consciousness. Well, that's kind of a new term. And we have to, then with that, we have to figure out what level of consciousness does what. And we know that Plato addresses that a great deal. His doctrine of forms is central to the notion that there's a world of objectivity that exists, that persists, and that is the source of really all our ordinary ideas. And so how do we find out what these forms of justice, of beauty, of truth are, and how do we interpret how to draw them down into our thinking mind and make sense of them and turn them into practical applications. Well, I'll leave you one other idea that comes through in the reading. There are many, so I do suggest that you read the paragraph on integration and synthesis, which Raghavan Iyer has written, and in which he says the philosophy of perfectibility. Now, what on earth is that? Well, we need to think about that. And so that might be part of your discussion today. He says it's based upon the divine dialectic which proceeds through progressive universation, profound synthesis, and playful integration. And perhaps we did not emphasize enough that in Platonic texts, what we find are dialogues. And there are estimated to be about 32 dialogues, give and take on a few debates. So between the Q&A of the Upanishads, the dialogues of Plato, that gives us a good grounding for method. It involves both listening and reading, and it involves follow-up questions in order to gain more penetrating insight into the nature of reality, the nature of ourselves, and connecting ourselves with that famous statement, that thou art. Thank you.